Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to this episode of the Examine Life with Phil. This is the second part of a two-part discussion I did with Ben Arbour on the Ontological Argument. If you haven't listened to the first part from last week, I'd recommend you go back and do that now, because it's probably not going to be very easy to follow our discussion without listening to the first part. This time around, I'm going to throw a bunch of objections to the Ontological Argument at Ben and give him a chance to respond, and these are the objections that I think tend to be the most reasonable and thoughtful objections, the ones that actually might have some merit, as opposed to the spurious and foolish ones that he and I talked about last time around. So I'll just go right into the discussion, and as always, hope you enjoy it. Well, hopefully not all these objections are from bad guys, because I think, actually every objection I'm citing here is from somebody who claims to believe in God, so...
Okay, all right.
Okay, so the first one, and this is the one that I think is probably the most common one, is what I'm going to term the common sense objection. That is, you can't just reason things into existence like this. And I've got a quote from William Alston where he expresses this. He says, quote, "We can say of this being," and here he means God, "that it is infinite, wise, just, merciful, all-knowing, and so forth. But when we add, and really exists, something jars us. We are seized with logical vertigo. That is, we want to say, this is different. But how can this feeling be justified? What is so different about it? Well, in all other cases, we remain within the sphere of ideas or concepts. But when real existence is asserted, we step outside that sphere, and this cannot be done solely from an examination of its contents. We must look outside and see what is there. Distinction of what is in the understanding can never tell us of what is in the real world, any more than analysis of my dreams can tell me which of their contents, if any, faithfully represents real objects." And then Alston will go on to criticize the usual response of ontological argument proponents that God is a special case as an example of a special pleading. So that's probably the most common, maybe not the most common objection, but I think a fairly common sense objection is that you're just kind of taking things where you can make a coherent concept in your head, where you can make all the logic work, and then saying, and therefore it exists.
Very good. So lots to respond to here. I'm going to kind of rapid fire this and shotgun approach it.
Okay.
I agree with Alston. We cannot just reason things into existence. And that is not what the ontological argument is attempting to do. Nor is it a case of special pleading, that we're going to make allowances for this in ways that we would not elsewhere. However, even if it were a case of special pleading, which I don't think it is, it sure seems like God might be a place where you would want to allow for special pleading and not elsewhere. I mean,
yeah.
when we talk about possible worlds and worlds as states of affairs, it's true that we can develop a giant truth table and look at propositions and figure out whether the proposition is true or false relative to that world. But we would also want to say that if God really is God, God isn't just something that is a part of that world. God is also something that transcends all worlds. Mm-hmm. And I'm fairly sympathetic to some Thomistic objections that would just say maybe God is transcendent in a way that renders it difficult to talk about these things in those ways. So I just kind of want to say, yes, I agree, but even if I'm wrong about this, then there's alternative responses that you can go down and alleviate some of this pressure. But there's yet another way, right? We're talking about real existence. So I want to defend something like a correspondence theory of truth, or at least, so I never met Dr. Alston, and I wish that I had.
Yeah, me too.
But he wrote a book called A Realist Conception of Truth, and I think it's right. I think it's in some ways it's very much compatible with like a correspondence theory, but it's also compatible with maybe axiomatic theories or perhaps even deflationary theories of truth. I don't know. But I don't want to defend like just a coherence theory or a performative theory, pragmatic theory of truth. I want a realist conception of truth. And one of the things that I'm convinced of metaphysically is that truth is a property that supervenes upon being. And what I mean by that is this. In order for anything to be true, it has to exist. Now, I hold to some views, along with Peter Van Inwagen, about fictional objects that become kind of weird here. And this view is known as realism about fictional objects. So Alston seems to suggest that all these things about his dreams, when we step outside of the concept of ideas and into real existence, things get tricky. But why is that the case? I mean, like, do ideas exist or not? If they exist, then they can be true. If they do not exist, then they cannot be true, because truth supervenes upon being. And I think I can illustrate this in the following way. Suppose that I say Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad. Is that true or false?
Well, see, I would want to say that's true because I've seen that movie, but in a certain sense, they're fictional characters, so in a certain sense, it might not be true, but at least in one sense it is.
Right.
So.
But if in any sense it's true, and you're committed with me to the thesis that truth supervenes upon being, then it means that in at least some sense, Luke Skywalker exists. Because we can speak truly about Luke Skywalker. Now,
that follows.
Maybe it's speaking truly about him relative to some domain, some subworld, right? But we can also speak falsely, right? If I say that the wizard Gandalf is Luke Skywalker's father, that's not true, right?
Yeah.
Or if I say that, I don't know, Harry Potter commands the Starship Enterprise, that's false. So the way that you think about some of these things gets really tricky. But if there is a way to speak truly about whether or not Superman and Clark Kent are one and the same person, or whether Bruce Wayne and the Dark Knight are one and the same person, then there has to be some domain of existence where those things exist, because truth supervenes upon being. Now, there's a long debate about whether or not this entails certain views about neo-Meinongianism and whether square circles exist, or whether square circles are impossible, but they exist and they don't exist, and things get really tricky. And I don't necessarily want to cloud the waters there, but it's not at all clear to me that ontological arguments are saying God does not exist, and then we're just going to think about God, and through reasoning, then on the other side of the argument, God is going to exist, and we produce the existence of God by way of reasoning. That seems to be what would be required from Alston's objection, and it's just, no, I deny that's what I'm doing. I deny that that's what Al is doing in his argument. I deny that that's what Eugen or Michael Almeida or any of these other people are doing in their arguments, and they would all deny it as well. So that's an uncharitable interpretation of what's going on in ontological arguments.
Okay. Yeah, so you're saying more or less that's just not what the argument's doing. It's not taking something that doesn't exist and adding existence to it and then declaring victory.
Bingo. And there's half a dozen other responses to some of the garbage that's baked into that stuff. So yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm inclined to agree with you there in the sense that if something like that is happening, it's certainly not intentional or prima facie. If so there is something like that's happening, it's very, very, very deeply in, as you said earlier, like the metaphysics of modality, where it's not like anybody's doing this dishonestly or anything like that. So yeah. Okay. Well, moving on. I said earlier that I was only going to throw you what I considered good objections, but I kind of misspoke or lied, because I'm going to give you Kant's objection, which I don't think is a very good objection. And the reason I'm doing this is it's my understanding that this is the most popular objection you're going to hear in academic philosophy, where people just assume Kant's objection to the ontological argument just completely destroyed it. Now, right. I don't think it does. I think this is a very poor objection, but because it's so popular, I felt like it'd be good to address it. So what Kant said here is, and it's kind of, for people who aren't familiar, this is kind of esoteric language because Kant wrote a long time ago, but we'll do our best here. Kant said, being is obviously not a real predicate, i.e. a concept of something that could add to the concept of a thing. It is merely the positing of a thing or of certain demonstrations in themselves. In the logical use, it is merely the copula of a judgment. The proposition God is omnipotent contains two concepts that have their objects God and omnipotence. The little word is not a predicate in it, but only that which posits the predication in relation to the subject. Now, if I take the subject, God, together with his predicates, among which omnipotence belongs, and say God is, or there is a God, and then I add no new predicate to the concept of God, but only posit the subject in itself with all its predicates, and indeed posit the object in relation to my concept, both must contain exactly the same, and hence I think this object is given absolutely through the expression it is. Nothing is thereby added to the concept which expresses merely its possibility. Thus, the actual contains nothing more than merely the possible, which is probably a pretty big mouthful for people. But as I understand it, what he's saying is existence is not what he means by predicate is property. He's saying existence is not a property. You can't just say that something has the property of existence. So what he would mean by that is, I'm pretty sure that I exist, and I'm pretty sure that you, Ben, exist, but we wouldn't have the property of existing because that's something that just can't be there.
So Kantian objections to ontological arguments are complicated, and they're built out of a larger framework of Kantian philosophy that we don't have time to engage in here. But distinctions between the noumenal and the phenomenal, and his groundwork for metaphysics gets really tricky. The last sentence in the quote, thus the actual contains nothing more than the merely possible. I don't find anything objectionable about that. We even discussed this earlier. If something is actual, then it has to be possible.
Yep.
So if that's his conclusion, great, all well and fine. But to say that existence doesn't function as a predicate, he's got some interesting arguments there, but it sure seems like there's a huge distinction between me talking about a unicorn and a unicorn that actually exists as a concrete particular, as opposed to just an idea that's a figment of my imagination. There's the kinds of unicorns that I could physically get on top of and ride like a horse, and then there's the kinds of unicorns that I can imagine myself being able to get on top of and ride, but I can't physically do it because those unicorns aren't real in the sort of concrete particular way. So I just don't, that's the way that I would want to push back. There's umpteen other ways to push back against Kant. I'm sure, you should tell me what's your favorite way to push back, because I know you dealt with this when you were writing your thesis.
Yeah, well, I kind of just want to deny that same thing, like kind of what you're saying, where to say that being is not a real predicate, that being isn't a property, I'm like, well, how do you make sense of that? Because prima facie, that seems like one of the most obvious things there is. Like, I see things that exist, and I'm aware of things that don't exist anymore because they're gone. Like, there are some books that I don't have anymore. They're gone. And maybe that's, in some cases, it's because they've been destroyed. They don't exist anymore. Existence does seem to be something that's bestowed and then goes away in many cases. I was born, and it seems to me when I was born, well, not when I was born, when I was conceived in every sense that matters, I began to exist. One day I'm going to die, and then I won't exist. So I really just don't know how to make sense of that idea that being is not a real predicate, a real property, because it just seems so obvious that it is. I don't know. Yeah.
Right. So I'm obviously very sympathetic to what you're saying. I want to just stipulate that I'm no expert in Kant.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend that people check in with Andrew Chignell, see what he thinks about this, because he would be able to say things that are a lot more interesting than anything I could add.
Okay. There's actually, let me hang on a sec. Never mind. I was looking for a quote I could read more on Kant's objection, but it doesn't really apply here. So, okay, let's move on.
Okay.
Now, here are two objections. I'm going to give you three objections from St. Thomas Aquinas, which I think are pretty good objections in that, although Aquinas was responding to Anselm's version of the argument, not modern modal versions,
right?
I think his objections are actually pretty substantive in that they could actually be applied to modal versions as well, which is pretty astonishing given that he predates them by like 400 or 500 years. So rather than reading his quote, I'll just summarize, and he gives these objections in the Summa Theologica. First, he argued that Anselm's ontological argument doesn't work because not everyone has the same idea in mind when they speak of God, and as evidence for this, he cited the fact that some people thought God has a body. So what he's saying here is that, in a sense, Anselm's version of the argument is guilty of equivocation because a person who's a polytheist would not understand the word God in the same way that Anselm, Aquinas, and Ben and I do. That person may hear the word God with a capital G and yet be defining it as God with a little g. That is, they might be thinking of, say, Thor or Zeus or something along those lines.
Right.
And his second objection is that because we have an idea in our minds, it does not follow from that alone that the idea actually exists. And this is, I think, very similar to Alston's objection. But his third and most important, I'd say primary objection, is that something can be self-evident in either one of two ways. That is, on the one hand, self-evident in and of itself, though not to us. On the other hand, self-evident in itself and to us. Hence, a proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the ratio of the subject, as man is an animal, for animal belongs to the ratio of man. Now, because we do not know because we do not know about God what he is, the proposition is not self-evident to us, but needs to be demonstrated by things that are more known to us, that's less known as far as their nature, namely through their effects. And in this third objection, what Aquinas is doing is he's drawing a distinction between what is self-evident and what we can know about it. So according to him, we need to know the nature, essence, or core of a thing to know that it is self-evident. Since no human being can, according to Aquinas, since no human being can actually know the nature of God, only God himself could make use of the ontological argument. That is, we can only speak of God and creatures analogically, not univocally. So those are Aquinas's three objections. I think it'd probably be fair to say that you've already kind of dealt with the second one, but what would you say to his first and third one there?
So the first one, that not everybody understands by God the same thing, is a terminological dispute that I think can be addressed by analytic philosophy. Hooray!
Yeah.
More clarity in just defining our terms. And so not just using some generic term and hoping that everybody understands what that means, but by actually putting some meat on the bone. So when we talk about maximal greatness, this is what I mean. This is what is entailed by that. Oh, I don't think it means that. Okay, well, why don't you think it means that? I'll give you these arguments, and then you have a discussion about that. But eventually, on the other side of that discussion, you get to an agreed upon definition of whatever it is in play. And if you can't arrive at that, well, then you don't proceed to the argument. You continue to work until you have an agreed upon definition. So I think his first argument is something that can be dealt with. The third argument is a little trickier, but you respond to the first one first.
I was going to say I agree. I think that's he's got a point there, but I think that's more, like you're saying, that's a case where you can find ways around that, and that's more like an objection to when, say, the ontological argument is used in like very flippant ways, where somebody just says, well, do you think it's possible God exists? Reasonable people will probably say, well, yeah, maybe. And then if they don't go on and define, well, this is what I mean by God, this is what I mean by possible, well, then you could easily have some equivocation going on there. But if you try to have an in-depth discussion like you and I are doing now, well, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be having any equivocation like that going on.
Right. Now, once you have done all that hard work to really define the terms, then you get to this other issue. And Thomas is no dummy.
For sure, yeah.
I'm sympathetic to some of his worries here about analogical predication. And so the way that I want to respond to that is by saying, I mean, my intuitions tend more towards Anselmian intuitions. But if people are worried about that because God is other, God is transcendent, and we can only know God by way of his effects, not by way of his essence. Okay, I don't think I agree, but I can concede the point for the sake of the discussion and just say that all of my reasoning, everything that I would have to say about any of this, put it all together in a big bundle, and then put giant parentheses around all of it. And at the beginning of that parentheses, before I say anything, just put Thomistically analogical as a giant modifier, and then say everything that I'm saying about all this is analogical predication. What does that mean? Well, that's part of the mystery. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty convinced from Thomas that what Thomas taught is that on the basis of philosophy or natural theology, independent of any kind of special revelation, we can know that there is a God, but we cannot know who God is. I think that we can, on the basis of natural theology, know a little more than Aquinas thought that we could. I think that we can know that there is a God. I think that we can know that God exists of necessity. And I think that we can know that God is a maximally great being. Now, whether or not that maximally great being is something like classical theism or something like theistic personalism, I'm not 100% persuaded that we can get that strictly by way of natural theology. I think we need the assistance of special revelation, tradition, other things involved. And I'm willing to throw my hat in as a defendant of like hardcore classical theism. I want my omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipresence. I want my divine timelessness. I want necessary existence. I want impassibility, immutability. I want divine simplicity, aseity. I want the whole package of.
Yeah, my Thomas friends are going to be happy to hear you say that.
Yeah, sure. So, and I think that being is the maximally great being. But, you know, I have plenty of friends who would say, "Oh no, Ben, that's not the right way to think about that." And you know, it would clearly be superior for God to exist in time now than to exist outside of time. And you know, those are interesting discussions. And this is where I think some of what Thomas is saying here comes into play. And I'm, although I think there's good arguments for classical theism, I'm willing to set all of that to one side and say that that's all rather ancillary, it seems to me, to a debate about whether or not a maximally great being exists. Mm-hmm. What the nature of that maximally great being is a separate question of whether or not that maximally great being exists. What Thomas is poking at here, though, is to say, that the essence of the maximally great being, we couldn't use that essence to prove that that being exists unless we knew what that essence was.
Mm-hmm.
We can't know what that essence is. Well, I take issue with him saying that we can't know. We might not be able to know finally what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the theistic personalists and the classical theists are going to agree that God is omnipotent, or at least maximally powerful.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to agree that God exists of necessity, right? At least most of them. I mean, there are some exceptions. I know Richard denies that God is a necessarily existent being. So does Bill Hasker. And for that matter, so does Tom Senor. But like the overwhelming majority of theists believe that if God exists and God is a maximally great being, that God exists of necessity. So
yeah, even though he thinks God isn't a necessary being, when in The Coherence of Theism, Swinburne actually writes that the vast majority of philosophers have held that God is a necessary being. So
yeah, right. So anyway, hopefully that at least assuages some concerns by trying to meet Thomas halfway, pushing back where he needs to get pushed back on, but also being sympathetic to saying, look, analogical predication is really important. So I get it.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying there correctly, you're kind of saying, well, Aquinas is saying that he's a little bit wrong and he's a little bit right. Where he's a little bit wrong here is in saying that you have to fully or completely know God's essence in order to say he's necessary and get the first premise of the ontological argument. But where he's a little bit right is in saying, well, yeah, for the most part, we often do have to speak of God analogically.
Yeah,
is that
that's right.
Okay, yeah. And I think I'm kind of inclined to agree with you there too. I've kind of held that I think, as you and I were talking about before we started the recording, there's a really a good point he's making there in the doctrine of analogy, that God is different and other than us. But at the same time, it could get pushed a little too far, because in order to make good arguments about things, you kind of have to speak univocally. And we all want to make good arguments about God. That's what we're trying to do here with the ontological arguments. That's what we try to do with all kinds of arguments. That's what Aquinas tried to do with his 5 ways. And I think at least some of them are as good as any other argument for the existence of God. So
exactly, yes.
Okay. So you mentioned denying that God is necessary, and that's good, because that's the next objection that I would want to raise, that I think is at least possibly a good one. And pardon me, I had a dry mouth there.
No
and
problem.
Here I'm going to be pulling from Richard Swinburne, where he denies that God's metaphysically necessary, and he gives 2 reasons for this. The first is he claims that modal properties are primarily properties of sentences and only derivatively of the propositions they express. So he says that a sentence is logically necessary if its negation entails a contradiction. And based in part on this, he says that he agrees with David Hume's idea that the mere non-existence of any kind of being of some kind cannot entail a contradiction. It follows that no positive existential sentence can be logically necessary, and so no sentence can express a logically necessary position. And extrapolating from that, Swinburne then goes on to argue that if proponents of ontological arguments are going to claim there is no God is impossible, because that's what follows from saying God is necessary, they must hold that other statements like no one knows anything about the past are also impossible. His point here is that there is nothing explicitly contradictory, or at least prima facie contradictory or impossible, about no one knows everything about the past. That is, a world where no one knows everything about the past certainly seems like a possible world as we can imagine and conceive it. However, Swinburne argues that proponents of ontological arguments are logically required to claim that this possible world is impossible. For if no one knows everything about the past does not entail a contradiction and so is possible, then there is an omniscient person could not be logically necessary. And that is, if it were logically necessary that there is a God, he could not be omniscient. And so Swinburne has extensively spelled out. No, that actually goes on into things that don't really matter there. The irony here is that this objection is best expressed by a Christian philosopher who does believe in God. In fact, all of the objections here that I found good are from Christian philosophers who believe in and have argued extensively for God. So,
Right.
What do you say to Swinburne's objection that, and I think he actually does say that he thinks God is logically necessary, but not metaphysically necessary, if I'm getting that right. So.
Right. So, and there's some confusion about the way that Richard is using the terms there, right? And we just don't have time to get into standard use of logically necessary versus metaphysical necessity and the interplay. But there's another piece that you're citing some stuff that he wrote from the Coherence of Theism.
Yes.
There's a second edition to that, and I don't know which version you're citing from, but I don't think his views have evolved a whole lot on this. He's been holding the same views for quite some time.
Well, this is from the second edition, and I actually asked him about his views on this at a conference, and he held to this pretty strongly. He doesn't think the ontological argument works for these reasons.
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of time with Richard, and let me just say that he is one of the world's premier Christian philosophers.
Absolutely, yes.
And I disagree with him as the low man on the totem pole, recognizing him to be the high man on the totem pole.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, this is something that I've done some thinking about, and I don't mind challenging his views. We spent quite a bit of time together in Houston a year ago, and we talked about some of this stuff. And I just, look, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And everything that you've just read in this quote, I think is exactly right, and I think it works the exact opposite of what Swinburne thinks it does.
Okay. Yeah,
so the idea that it's possible that no one knows everything about the past. False. God exists in every world. So in every world, there are at least 3 people who know everything about the past. The Father,
God,
the Son, and the Spirit.
Yeah.
So there are no possible worlds in which no one knows everything about the past. That's just the nature of God. Now, if you want God to be something less than a being that exists in all possible worlds, then we fundamentally disagree about the nature of maximal greatness. And I need an account as to why your God, which exists in not every possible world, could be superior to a God that does exist in every possible world. And the only account that I've heard that even comes close to making sense of this is the account that's given by Tom Senor. And Tom thinks that God is not a necessarily existent being because there is one and only one. There is exactly one world in which God does not exist, and that is the empty world, the world in which nothing at all exists. Because Tom thinks that God is the creator of everything. So if there is a world with anything in it, then God would have to be there in that world to have created it.
Okay, yeah, that follows.
But maybe there's a world with nothing at all. Now, I'm doubtful about this. Now, and this gets me in trouble in set theory, right? Because, like, you have to have a null set in order to have any kind of set theory. It's just not clear to me that possible worlds are the same kinds of things as sets. They're states of affairs, but I'm not sure it's the same thing. So, Richard is also now beginning to articulate some ideas where he thinks that God is causa sui, and he thinks that there is a way in which God causes God's own existence. But I know this makes me like super unpopular, but again, I'm pretty comfortable with that. I'm very fine with the idea that God does not exist is a logical contradiction. There exists no God. Yes, it doesn't make any sense to say, because that is tantamount to saying there exists a world in which there does not exist a being that exists in all possible worlds. There's a being that exists in all possible worlds. But there's this one world where that being that exists in all possible worlds doesn't exist in that possible world. It's a contradiction.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
baked into the definition of God. And so if people want to object and hem and haw about all this, then I'm just gonna say, all right, we have fundamentally different understandings of the nature of God. Number one. Number two, I'm very happy to provide a justification for why things seem that way to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to be just the ontological argument. It's going to involve appealing to all sorts of other arguments.
Yeah, yeah, like you did earlier.
In conclusion, necessarily existent beings. So anyway, Richard and I have gone round and round about this. And
did he offer any replies to the response you just gave, or what?
Sure, but this comes down fundamentally to a disagreement on methodology. Okay.
Okay.
And one of the things that I've been working on and hope to continue to work on this next year, I'm giving a lecture on this in 2 weeks up in Arkansas called Against Philosophical Methodological Naturalism. Now, typically, when we think about methodological naturalism, we think about science.
Mm-hmm.
But I would suggest that a lot of the way that contemporary modal metaphysics is done is to think about, well, let's just think about a possible world. Could this be a possible world? Could that be a possible world? And it's all done independently of any questions about whether or not God exists and what God is like. And I think that's really stupid. Because
I see. Okay, yeah.
I think that whether or not God exists and what kind of God exists delimits the scope of what is actually possible. If God exists, then God exists of necessity. And if God exists and God is an omnibenevolent being, then there are all kinds of worlds that would otherwise be considered logically possible, but they turn out not to be possible, right?
Yeah, that seems to follow, yeah. Because if you know a thing or two about God, you would know, well, he's not going to create a world that is this way. He's going to create a world that might be this way, yeah.
His very existence would guarantee that the world couldn't be of this particular type. Now, if God did not exist, is that a possible world? Maybe, probably even. But we got to figure out the question of whether or not God exists, because whether or not God exists is going to be a factor in literally every single state of affairs that would count as a possible world.
That's good. I like that. Yeah.
This is a methodological consideration and that's where the fundamental disagreement between Richard and I is.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there. That was kind of my conclusion. It was very similar to yours there, where I said, well, what this doesn't necessarily show the argument doesn't work. What it shows is you're required to pick one or the other. Either God is necessary and therefore it really is impossible that no one knows everything about the past, or it really is the case that no one knows everything about the past, and this necessary God with a capital G, there's something wrong with that concept. You have to pick one or the other. There's no way around it, so to speak. It has to be one or the other. That's kind of what I saw as his point there is. And if you take it in that simpler sense, I think he's right, where, yeah, it has to be one or the other. But to show that it doesn't work entirely, I don't think that quite knocks it down either. So.
Right. Good.
Okay. Well, those are the objections that I found that I thought were the most substantive ones anyway. Are there any other objections you're aware of that you think are substantive or that give you pause or that you would like to address?
Well, I definitely think that there are important objections that stem from other disagreements in modal metaphysics, right? So Plantinga's argument hinges on a modal axiom called S5.
Yes.
There are plenty of metaphysicians who would object to S5. I am attracted to it, and I'm attracted to it for reasons that have recently been defended by very, very gifted philosophers, Alex Proust and Joshua Rasmussen, in their recent book, Necessary Beings. But I think that there are probably even other ways to get successful ontological arguments, even if you reject S5, right? My friend Ray Stewart has been developing some of this stuff. That if you hold on to if you reject S5, but you still hold on to like the basics of modal logic in S4 or System B, then you can still get the existence of God out of those. All you need to really affirm is principle of symmetry, and then you're going to be able to get, if you think that there's a possible world where God exists, then you're going to be able to get that God exists in this world. You won't be able to get that God exists in this world necessarily. You'd have to do some further reasoning to get there. But System B would get you there because you have principle of symmetry. If you think that S4 is true, then you have the principle of modal transitivity, and it's going to be a little trickier to get there, but you could probably do it. And if you have System B and transitivity, then you are basically all the way to S5. All you would need in order to add to B and S4 to get S5 is reflexivity, which that a world can see itself and be aware of itself. But I'm pretty convinced that you can have successful modal ontological arguments that establish the existence of God in the actual world without S5. And this is all Ray's work. I take no credit for any of that. He's really helped me see a lot of this, and I'm very thankful. He's finishing up his PhD at OU. I don't know if you say that Oklahoma University or the University of Oklahoma, but
yeah, I don't know that either. So
he's working with Linda Zagzebski up there, and I just think really highly of Linda. She's been very kind to me. And she's a great thinker, a Roman Catholic. So for all those who are concerned about bias, she is going to have Thomistic sympathies and definitely going to be a theist and a Christian at that. So anyway, that's kind of the way of me saying, here's an objection against modal ontological arguments. You reject S5. And then I think there are responses to that. Here's another objection. That is quite common.
Okay. Oh, do you mind? I was just going to say, to kind of agree with you there, that in the research I'd done, what I found is that, yeah, I think you're right. You can make a ontological argument for God on S4, but it's a little trickier. It's much easier to do it with S5.
Oh, yeah.
But it also seemed to me that the general consensus among modal logicians was that S5 just works. That it's more of a minority position to reject it. Does that square with what you found as well, or?
So I'll be honest and say that I have not done the research on all of the modal logic and reasons to agree or reject S5, but Joshua Rasmussen has persuaded me in his book and Alex Bruce, they co-authored this book, and it's the kind of book that you can only read a paragraph at a time because it's really hard and really dense, unless you know the material really, really well. But it's very well argued, and plenty of footnotes to go and read the counter arguments if you want to go and investigate. But having spent several days with the first few chapters of their book, I'm persuaded that S5 is the right way to think about modal logic. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I agree with you there. So, okay, please continue with what you were going to say.
Sure. So here's this other argument, right? The modal ontological argument proceeds by way of the chief premise, possibly God exists. Well, if I should think that, what about this other argument that says possibly God does not exist? And if possibly God does not exist, then you end up with a modal ontological argument for atheism. Because if it's even possible that there exists a world where a maximally great being does not exist, then that maximally great being doesn't exist in any world. Because if that maximally great being existed in any world, then it would exist in every world. So if there's even a single world where that being does not exist, and now we're kind of at a deadlock. Like, which one of these premises should we accept? We can either accept possibly God exists, but we can also accept possibly God does not exist. And that's something that's pretty serious. Why favor one instead of the other? And, this is something that I've really spent a lot of time really trying to think about. And I think that I have a cogent response, which is to say that when we're agnostic about some claim, we should favor the possibility over one of the stronger claims. So again, there's 3 different claims that we can make. We can say that something is possible, which is a weak claim, because to say that something is possible is to quantify over one world and say that there exists at least one world where this is the case. Or you can make stronger claims. You could say something is necessarily true, in which case you're quantifying over all of the possible worlds and saying that this thing is true in all worlds. Or you can say that something is impossible, in which case you're also quantifying over all of the worlds and saying that in none of the worlds is this true. So both the necessity and the impossibility claims are very, very strong claims, because you're talking about the entirety of the modal landscape. Whereas with the possibility claim, you're making a very modest claim. So I think that we should, when we're agnostic about some claim, default towards a more modest position. And I think that that's what the intellectual virtue of open-mindedness requires. And I've got a piece defending this that'll come out later this year. But that still doesn't resolve this tension, because the modest position would still be either possibly God exists or possibly God does not exist. So now what? Well, I think we have good reasons for wanting to favor positive existentials instead of negative existentials. So to say that possibly God exists is a positive thing, whereas to say that possibly God does not exist is a negative existential. Now, why? Why should we favor the positive existential instead of the negative existential? This has been an intuition of mine that I think I'm beginning to finally work out and have reasons for. Okay? We have these modal appearance claims, and these are situations where in our minds something just seems to be right. We have intuitions, right? So here I am looking at this lamp that's next to my computer, and I say, this lamp exists, and since it exists, it's possible that it exists. But it also seems perfectly possible that this lamp could not exist.
Yeah.
Now, what justifies the claim, possibly this lamp does not exist, where all I'm saying is there's a possible world where this lamp doesn't exist? Well, this is what seems to justify that. There actually exists some lamp, and the way that I am apprehending this lamp gives rise to a particular modal seeming. And the way that I'm apprehending this lamp, there's nothing that is apparently necessary about this lamp. I can certainly conceive of possible worlds in which this lamp does not exist. But there really is this lamp that exists that's giving rise to this kind of a seeming. There has to exist something that gives rise to the seeming. Now, when we do this for God, this is part of the way that we're not reasoning to the existence of God and thereby creating God by way of reason. This is Bill Alston's objection.
We're
not just reasoning God into existence as though God did not exist ahead of time. Rather, we're thinking about something. Something is appearing to us. What is it? God. And there's a seeming that arises from our grasping the concept of God in our heads, that God is a being than which none greater can be. I didn't say a being than which none greater can be conceived. That's Anselm. I'm making a total argument, the being than which none greater can be. And as long as that being exists, then it justifies the appearance claim, the seeming to me. If that being does not exist, then I am not justified in believing that that being possibly does not exist. There has to be something that gives rise to the modal appearance claim. Otherwise, we're just at a deadlock and there's no way to move forward for either the atheist or the theist. And that would require us to say that the argument is logically invalid. But basically nobody thinks the argument is logically invalid. We're only questioning whether the argument is sound. And I think that we have ways of resolving this. By the way, a lot of my thinking about these issues, and when I say a lot of my thinking, I mean like 99% of my thinking about modal seemings, I owe to my friend Chad McIntosh, who's finishing up his PhD at Cornell University. And he has a paper that he's written that he has not yet published that I've read over and over again, and it's very helpful. So I don't take any credit for developing this. It's all Chad's work.
Okay.
Numerous conversations with him. He's been really helpful in helping me organize my own thinking about that. So that's another objection, which is the why not think possibly God does not exist, and then a whole framework for rejecting why I think that's a really successful defeater against ontological arguments.
That's an interesting direction to go. I hadn't come across modal seemings in that sense before, but that's I kind of like that. That's something I really want to think about some more. So, but I come across that objection you were citing there. I forget. I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Robin Lee Padevin gives what he called a modal atheistic argument.
Yeah.
Or something similar to that.
Robin
where he says, say again?
His name is Robin Lepotovin.
Lepotovin. Okay. I'm horrible at pronouncing names if they're not something like Smith. So, which is very awkward when I'm trying to cite all these ancient philosophers because I can't pronounce any of their names. But yeah, he said it just like you were saying. His modal atheistic argument is 1, it is possible for God to exist, then necessarily God exists. 2a, it is possible that God does not exist, therefore from 2a it is the case that necessarily it is not the case that necessarily God exists, therefore it is not possible for God to exist. And I kind of looked at that and said, well, you're either contradicting yourself or you just misunderstand what it means to say that God is necessary. A necessary being cannot fail to exist. Therefore, your second premise, premise 2a, is false on premise 1, since if God necessarily exists, then it's impossible that he does not exist. If premise 1 is true, then the only counter response is to claim that God is impossible. You can't turn around and say it's possible that God does not exist. You have to claim it's impossible for God to exist.
Well, hang on. There's a misstep, just a very mild one in what you just said, right?
Okay. Well, please correct me then. Yeah.
If it is impossible that God exists, meaning there are no worlds in which God exists, then it is automatically true that it is possible that God does not exist.
Okay, yeah. It would work in that other direction. Yes, absolutely.
In very much the same way that we would say if it's necessarily the case that God exists, then it's possible that God exists, right? So it's the same maneuver, but I agree with the general point that you're making that there seems to be something contradictory in saying if the definition of God is a being that exists in all possible worlds, to say that it's possible that God does not exist is to say there is a possible world in which there is a being that exists in all possible worlds, but that being does not exist in this possible world. That's a contradiction.
Yeah.
And this is where I agree with Richard, so yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I would say the way to rescue his argument would be you just have to, scratch 1 and just go off of that second premise. And then you could say, well, that might work, but it doesn't necessarily prove one to the exclusion of the other, kind of like what we were talking about with Swinburne's objection earlier.
Right, and then you're going to need to find some other way to resolve the deadlock.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Okay, good deal.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any other objections that you wanted to think about or address? Or because I could talk about this kind of stuff forever. It's what I love doing. So. Yeah,
well, it is definitely interesting stuff. Those are the only 2 objections that you didn't already bring up. That now I will mention just one other thing. Spinoza has this really interesting ontological argument. Now, he's a really interesting view of God, and not one that I'm sympathetic to, but it's at least worth mentioning that on his view of God and the universe, ontological arguments are almost automatic. because he's something of a pantheist, and his reasoning would go like this: something exists, therefore God exists, because he thinks God just is kind of the material sum of the entire universe. Now, that's not the way that I think about God, but just one more example to show that there's no such thing as the ontological argument. There are lots of different ontological arguments. And the way that you think about who God is or what God might be like is definitely going to shape what you think about ontological arguments or modal ontological arguments, and whether or not you're going to think they're going to be successful or not. So that's, anyway, a lot to chew on tonight. But
yeah. Okay. Well, do you have any like recommendations where people could go if they wanted to start learning more about the ontological argument? Like we mentioned Plantinga's book, The Nature of Necessity, before, but I'd be inclined to say if you were just starting, that probably would be a bad place to start. So
yeah, I definitely think that would be a bad place to start.
Great place to go, but not a good place to start.
Yeah, but Plantinga wrote another book called God, Freedom, and Evil. And that book has two parts to it, a first part and a second part. The first part of that book is about the ontological argument. It's still kind of tough, but it's the best introduction that I can think of to the modal ontological argument. Yujin Nagasawa's recent book called Maximal God. It's a bit technical in places, but surprisingly accessible. That's with Oxford University Press. I would certainly recommend that book for somebody. I'm struggling to remember this, but Michael Ray has some comments about ontological arguments in a book. I think it's a philosophy of religion text, but I'm not 100% certain. And his version of the ontological argument is very similar to Yujin Nagasawa's recent reformulation of Anselmian theism. So that would be a good place. I have a couple of pieces that are forthcoming. They're not yet in print.
Okay.
But I do intend to make them available pretty soon on my web page, where people would be able to find some of that material. What else? There's
well, what's your web page there then?
Just academia.edu. I try to keep a current list of things that I've published up there. Trying to think. Cameron Bertuzzi runs an apologetic site called Capturing Christianity. And that's a place where Michael Almeida has published some stuff about ontological arguments that I think is really helpful. For those who are kind of critical of ontological arguments, I think one of the best pieces that expresses skepticism of ontological arguments is written by Peter van Inwagen, and it's just called Ontological Arguments. If I remember correctly, it was published in the journal Nous. I'm second-guessing myself, but I want to stand by that. Those would be some resources that I would point people to. And then, of course, Anselm's own original argument, the Proslogion, is a very, very short work that's quite accessible. So very important to consider the original sources. So yeah, those would be kind of the start points, I would guess.
Yeah,
there's others, and maybe we could put together a bibliography, and you could have it up for lots of discussion on ontological arguments. But those would be the key places where I would think listeners are going to be best suited to dive in.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Yeah. I would add that God, Freedom, and Evil was actually one of the very first philosophical books I read, long before I even got into philosophical studies. And it's one of the things that made me want to start thinking about things in a more philosophical way. But even then, even though it's so much simpler than Nature of Necessity, I had to go through it, like you're saying, several times because I just was not used to reading things in such a formulaic, analytic way as Plantinga writes that book, and rightly so. It's better for that, but if you're not used to reading that, it's going to be kind of jarring. So.
Yep. Yep. Well, you're not the only one who had to read and reread and reread, because I think the first time that I read that was, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago. And it was not the easiest read for me either. So you're not
about the same time I was reading it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you have any events, books, or anything coming up that you want to plug here before we finish up then?
Whew. The end of last year, a long-term project finally came out. It's a volume called Philosophical Essays Against Open Theism that was published with Routledge. It's currently only available in hardback, and it's stupid expensive right now at $140. But I like to pretend that it's still worth it. Lots of essays in there by philosophers who I really admire, Eleanor Stump, and Greg Welty, James Anderson. Catherine Rogers also has a really important piece in there, and Paul Helm, David Alexander, Sandra Visser.
Good.
Worried I'm leaving somebody out. Ken Perzik, Bob Stewart, who's a friend down in New Orleans, and Keith Wyma. So there's 10 essays in total, plus an introduction. So for people who are interested in open theism, that'd be a great place to check out.
Well, that ties in with the other thing I've been doing on the podcast, because I've been doing a big push on ways to address the problem of divine foreknowledge, and I've already had on somebody who presented the Reformed or Calvinist point of view. I've done an introductory podcast on it, and I just last week did some interview with somebody presenting the Molinist point of view.
Very good. So I'm curious, who did you have for the Calvinistic view?
A guy I know named Tim Carter, who I met locally through a apologetics conference in Springfield, who just takes that viewpoint. So I said, well, come on, let's talk about it. So
neat, cool. And who did you have to represent Molinism?
Peter Razor.
Okay.
He lives out in Arizona and teaches at Grand Canyon University there, and I met him through the Molinism group on Facebook. So
neat. Okay. Well, last week I was in New Orleans, and I gave a lecture called Molinism Has 99 Problems, but Being True Ain't One. With an homage to Jay-Z, that beautiful poet, right? So I'm not an anti-Molinist, but I just can't bring myself to buy it.
That was kind of similar to the position I took with Peter, where I'm saying, I'm really sympathetic. Come on, get me convinced. So
yeah. So of the 6 or 7 different responses to the dilemma of freedom and foreknowledge, I'm convinced that open theism is the wrong response. Any of the other ones I'm okay with. Like, I would much rather be there. The other big project I'm working on right now, I have a book that I'm co-editing with Greg Gansel called Christian Theology and the Modern Philosophers. And this is a history of philosophy of religion from Rene Descartes, the birth of the Enlightenment, up through Plantinga. And so that book is still a work in progress. We hope that it will be out in 2020. So that's something to look forward to. But it's not something that's getting ready to drop just right away.
Okay, cool. Good deal.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's kind of all we've got here. Do you have any sum up thoughts or anything else you want to say?
I think God is awesome. I think he is the awesomest awesome of all of the awesomes. And I think everybody should think that.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I'll just say this, that I like to think that I'm a reasonably accessible person, and I'm always willing to dialogue about stuff like this. I'm not hard to get in touch with online. I apologize up front. I'm really, really terrible at email. I'm just not good at it. I'm much better at texting or telephone conversations or Skype conversations. It just seems a lot more personal to me. But I would invite any criticism or feedback from any of your listeners. This is something that I enjoy thinking about, so it's not a headache for me to continue dialogues about ontological arguments or the existence of God, or the nature of the divine being, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks, Bill. This is really a treat for me to be able to get to dialogue with somebody who knows so much about ontological arguments and cares about them and thinks they're important. So I really appreciate the invite. This is really fun.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it greatly. Like you say, I like researching and talking about these issues. So talking with somebody who has thought a lot about it and is familiar with a lot of the sources and criticisms and things like that is really beneficial, and I really enjoyed it too.
And I also understand you and I are going to be at the same conference here in just a couple of weeks, so we'll be able to continue our conversation there.
Yeah, in 2 weeks I'll be at it's at Weatherford College down there in Texas the Philosophy, Religion, and Art Conference. Did I get that name right?
Or maybe it's the other way. Maybe it's Art and the Philosophy of Religion, but that'll be a fun one. So.
Okay, yeah, that'll be great. In fact, by the time this airs, we'll probably have already had that conference, because I'm running about 2 or 3 weeks ahead on the podcast schedule right now. So
good. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll just finish up the discussion then. And now it's time for all of you guys who listen, write in and let me know what you think. Let Ben know what you think. What do you think of the ontological argument? Tell me. I want to know. What do you think of the criticisms? Do you think some of them work? Tell me why. You can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I started a Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil, and you can leave comments there. They're always welcome. Write in and let me know what you think. If you have ideas for future show topics or guests or something, let me know. And if you like what I'm doing here on this podcast, by all means, share it with other people. Thanks, and you'll hear from me again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.